She raised her dog like a daughter. 20 years later, it returned to save her life. Welcome back and enjoy the story. Nancy had never been a mother. She wanted to be, more than anything. But life, with all its unpredictable twists, never gave her that chance. First came the miscarriages. Then came the loneliness after her husband left, saying quietly, "Maybe we just weren't meant for that kind of life." She never remarried. In her small home with ivy-covered walls in Chicago's northern suburbs, surrounded by silence, Nancy often sat by the window with her hands resting on her lap, staring out at the world that seemed to pass her by. The changing seasons marked time like pages turning in a book no one was reading. Spring blooms faded to summer heat, autumn leaves fell, and winter snows piled against her doorstep. Still, Nancy waited, though she wasn't sure what for anymore. The neighbors invited her to dinner sometimes. Friends from church called, but the emptiness inside her grew, vast as the Lake Michigan shoreline on a foggy morning. Nothing filled the void where her dreams of motherhood had once lived. Until one rainy afternoon in 2005, something changed. A box meowed, or so she thought. Nancy wrapped her cardigan tighter and stepped outside onto her porch, where the rain drummed steadily against the awning. There, by her front door, sat a soggy cardboard crate. But it wasn't a kitten inside. It was a trembling little puppy, brown, matted, with eyes too big for his face. He looked at her, head tilted, and something inside her cracked open like spring ice on the Chicago River. "Hello there," she whispered, kneeling despite the dampness soaking through her slacks. The puppy whimpered, pressing himself against the far corner of the box. Nancy reached in slowly, her fingers trembling almost as much as the tiny creature. When she finally touched his damp fur, he froze, then leaned imperceptibly into her touch. She lifted him out, cradling him against her chest. "Who would leave you here?" she murmured, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her palm. There was no note, no explanation, just a frightened puppy and a woman who had spent years preparing for someone who never arrived. She named him Ulysses. From that day on, Nancy stopped waiting for a child to arrive. She poured all the love she had. Saved, years of lullabies, hugs never given, meals never prepared, into that little dog. She fed him by hand, sewed tiny sweaters for Chicago's bitter winters, celebrated his birthdays with candles and cupcakes, dog-friendly of course, and even read to him at night, her voice soft in the quiet house as she shared her favorite stories. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Nancy's home transformed. The spare room she had once painted pale yellow for a nursery became Ulysses' space, with a plush dog bed, toys carefully arranged in baskets, and photos on the walls documenting his growth. She bought a camera specifically to capture his firsts. First trip to Lake Michigan, first snowfall, first time he caught a squirrel unawares in the backyard, though thankfully he let it go. Her refrigerator, once bare, except for takeout menus and a forgotten shopping list, now displayed Ulysses' artwork. Paw prints pressed onto construction paper with non-toxic paint, alongside photographs of him wearing the little bow ties. Nancy found at a pet boutique downtown. They went everywhere together, the market, the park, even church. Mrs. Hartwell, who played the organ, initially frowned at the small dog sitting attentively in the pew, but even she eventually relented, sometimes slipping Ulysses a treat after the service. He became Nancy's shadow, her child, her reason to get up in the morning. "I didn't know what to do with all this love," she confided to her sister during a rare phone call. "Now I do." People laughed sometimes. Nancy overheard comments at the dog park, where she took Ulysses daily for exercise and socialization. "It's just a dog," they'd say when she mentioned canceling plans because Ulysses had seemed under the weather. or when they noticed the homemade meals she prepared for him, carefully researched for canine nutrition. But to Nancy, Ulysses was never just anything. He was her family, the connection she had waited for, the recipient of all the tenderness that had built up inside her over decades of waiting. Her neighbor, Frank Williams, watched this unusual relationship develop over the years. A widower himself, he understood loneliness, but couldn't quite comprehend the depth of Nancy's attachment. "You spoil that dog something fierce," he commented one day as Nancy walked past his yard, Ulysses trotting beside her in a knitted sweater, despite the mild spring weather. Nancy just smiled. "We all need someone to spoil, don't we, Frank?" Will Ulysses find a way to heal Nancy's broken heart, or will her excessive devotion only lead to greater heartache? Stay tuned to find out. Years passed. Ulysses aged slowly, then all at once, his muzzle grayed around the edges, frost creeping across dark fur. His legs stiffened, particularly on cold Chicago mornings when the wind swept off the lake. His eyes clouded, but never stopped following Nancy as she moved around the house, his adoration undimmed by time or physical limitations. Nancy adapted. She built small ramps so Ulysses could still climb onto his favorite chair by the window. She learned to massage his arthritic joints and researched supplements to ease his discomfort. When his hearing began to fail, she developed hand signals to complement her verbal commands. At night, when the neighborhood fell quiet and streetlights cast long shadows across her living room, Nancy often sat on the floor beside Ulysses's bed, stroking his fur and humming the lullabies she had once imagined singing to a child. Sometimes she told him stories about the life they had shared, remembering their adventures at the lake, the time he had chased a butterfly for 3 blocks, the Christmas he had unwrapped all his presents and Frank's too when no one was looking. One evening, as autumn leaves skittered across her front yard and the first hint of winter chilled the air, Nancy sat quietly with him on the couch, stroking his fur. Humming softly, she whispered, "If love could keep you young, Ulysses, you'd live forever." He looked at her with eyes that, despite their cloudiness, seemed to understand everything she'd never said aloud. How he had saved her, how he had filled her empty spaces, how he had taught her that family comes in forms you don't expect. And then, a few weeks later, he was gone. Nancy held him in her arms as he took his last breath on a crisp November morning. She didn't cry loudly. The grief was too deep for sound, too vast for tears. It settled in her bones like the Chicago winter, cold and unrelenting. She buried him in the backyard beneath the old maple tree and placed a hand-painted stone that read, "You were all the family I ever needed." Frank stood beside her at the small ceremony, uncharacteristically quiet. Pastor Lewis from church came too, offering a prayer that spoke of all types of love being sacred. They left Nancy alone afterward, sensing that her grief required solitude. Have you ever loved a pet so deeply that they became family? Tell us about your special animal companion in the comments. The world felt empty again. Nancy's house, once filled with the click-clack of paws on hardwood and the jingle of collar tags, fell silent. She stopped singing. Meals became cold plates, left untouched. No more walks along the lakeshore, no more birthdays marked with small celebrations. The sweaters and toys remained where they were, untouched, like artifacts in a museum of lost happiness. Some suggested she get another dog. It might help, her sister said during their monthly call. Nancy always declined. There won't be another Ulysses, she would say softly and change the subject. People who had once judged her devotion now worried about her withdrawal. Frank brought casseroles that went uneaten. Church members invited her to events she never attended. Gradually they stopped trying so hard, and Nancy retreated further into her quiet house with its memories. 2 decades had passed since Ulysses arrived at her door, and now there was only silence again. Nancy had grown older too, her movements slower, her own hair now silvery grey. She still sat by the window sometimes, but now she stared at the Maple tree in the backyard rather than the street beyond. I miss you, boy, she would whisper to the empty room, every single day. Winter settled over Chicago again, harsh and unforgiving. Nancy's arthritis flared with the cold, making simple tasks difficult. She forgot things sometimes, taking her medication, locking the door, turning off the stove. But she managed. She had always managed, even in her deepest loneliness, until the night Nancy had the stroke. She was in the kitchen when her knees buckled suddenly. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the linoleum. Her face twisted, muscles rebelling against her brain's commands. Her words slurred into unintelligible sounds as she tried to call for help. She fell, unable to reach the phone on the counter just feet away, alone, helpless, on the cold tile floor, or so she thought. Could something truly miraculous be happening in Nancy's darkest hour? What forces of love might transcend even death itself? At 2:13 a.m., a neighbor across the street heard loud, frantic barking. But there was no dog. Melinda Chen had lived opposite Nancy for only 3 years. They exchanged pleasantries occasionally, but weren't close. She knew about the old, a dog that had died before she moved in, only because Frank had mentioned it once. Now, awakened from a sound sleep, Melinda sat up in bed, confused by the insistent barking that seemed to be coming from Nancy's yard. The barking didn't stop. It howled and echoed through the empty yard, urgent and demanding. Confused, Melinda pulled on her robe and boots, thinking perhaps a stray had wandered in. But when she reached Nancy's porch, silence. Then a faint sound, a whimper. Something compelled her to peer through the window rather than return home. She peeked through the kitchen window, cupping her hands around her eyes to block the reflection. Nancy was lying on the floor, barely conscious, her face ashen in the dim light from the stove hood. Emergency services arrived just in time. Sirens splitting the night's quiet. Neighbors emerged from their homes in robes and slippers as Nancy was rushed to the hospital. The doctors later said 5 more minutes and she might not have made it. Frank paced the hospital waiting room, blaming himself. I should have checked on her more, he repeated to anyone who would listen. Pastor Lewis organized a prayer circle. Melinda brought flowers, though Nancy was unconscious for days afterward. When she finally awoke, tubes running from her arms and machines beeping steadily beside her bed. They told her about the neighbor, the strange barking. But I don't have a dog, Nancy whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. They nodded. I know, said Melinda, equally confused. That's why I thought I imagined it. But it was so loud, so desperate, like someone was trying to get my attention. Nancy's hands trembled as she raised them to her face. Ulysses, she said, the name catching in her throat. The others exchanged concerned glances, attributing her words to confusion from medication or the stroke itself. Only Frank stood perfectly still, a strange expression crossing his weathered face. 20 years is a long time to wait, he said quietly, but not for that kind of love. Physical therapy was grueling. Nancy struggled with simple tasks, holding a spoon, buttoning her cardigan, walking from her bed to the bathroom. Some days, frustration overwhelmed her, and she wondered if recovery was worth the effort. On those days, she would close her eyes and imagine Ulysses waiting for her, and somehow find the strength to try one more time. When Nancy returned home weeks later, supported by Frank on one side and a walker on the other, the house felt different, warmer somehow, less empty, despite its unchanged contents. That night, after her home health aide had left and the house fell quiet, Nancy walked slowly to the backyard, to Ulysses' grave beneath the maple tree. The stone marker had weathered over the years, but his name remained clear in the moonlight. Knees weak, voice trembling, she knelt down with difficulty and whispered, "Was that you, baby? Did you come back?" A breeze swept through the tree branches above. The wind chimes above the porch clinked gently, the same way they used to. When Ulysses ran out to greet her after she'd been away, A warmth enveloped her that had nothing to do with the spring air. From that day on, Nancy never doubted it. Her Ulysses, her boy, her companion, her child in fur, had come back one last time to save her. Not everyone believed it, of course. The doctors suggested that perhaps Melinda had heard a stray dog or even a coyote. They sometimes ventured into suburban areas during harsh winters. Pastor Lewis spoke kindly of faith and comfort in believing what brings peace. Others were less generous, whispering about elderly confusion and grief-induced fantasy. But Nancy knew what she knew with her whole heart. And when she tells the story now, sitting in her living room with new strength in her voice, her hands no longer shake with uncertainty. He wasn't just a dog, she says, looking out the window where he used to sit watching for her return. He was my child. And love that pure never leaves us. It always finds a way back. Recovery continued, slow but steady. Nancy regained her speech completely, though her left hand remained slightly weaker than before. She started inviting people over again, Frank most frequently, but also church members and even Melinda, who had begun to drop by regularly. On Ulysses' birthday, rather than mourning alone, Nancy hosted a small gathering. She showed photographs and told stories that made everyone laugh. She served cupcakes, human ones this time, with little bone-shaped decorations on top. "To Ulysses," Frank toasted, raising his teacup. "The best damn dog in Chicago." "To Ulysses," the others echoed, and Nancy felt something she hadn't experienced in years, joy, uncomplicated by grief. 6 months after her stroke, Nancy made a decision. She visited the local animal shelter, not looking for a replacement. There could never be one, but ready to share her home again. She chose an older dog, a 10-year-old retriever mix with arthritic hips and soulful eyes. The shelter worker seemed surprised, explaining that senior dogs rarely found homes. "We understand each other," Nancy said simply, scratching behind the dog's graying ears. She named him Victor, and though she never loved him quite the same way, first loves, even those with 4 paws, leave permanent imprints, she loved him fully, with the wisdom of someone who understood the gift of borrowed time. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.